Here's the part of The Sopranos that fans argue about, but rarely say out loud. Jason Barone might be the show's most realistic disaster. Jason Barone's moment of revelation, "Oh, Tony Soprano," deserves recognition as one of the series' most unintentionally comedic displays of inherited ineptitude. Confronted with the wildly cryptic name Anthony Soprano, the young heir behaves as though he's deciphering an ancient cipher, rather than recognizing the man who loomed over his childhood. Only after being shown an actual photograph does the light bulb flicker on. Evidently, connecting Anthony to Tony was too Olympian a leap for this particular mind. The absurdity doesn't end there. Jason confidently strides into his father's business, an operation long intertwined with New Jersey's most notorious figure, and announces plans to sell it off, all while his mother quietly permits it. Not one hint, not one whisper, not even a gentle suggestion that perhaps Barone Sanitation's relationship with the Soprano Empire might complicate a clean, above-board sale. The silence is almost impressive. If parental overprotection is a motif of the series, here it graduates into something bordering on sabotage. This pattern repeats across the narrative. Parents shielding their offspring so thoroughly from reality that the children become liabilities the moment life requires competence. Jackie Jr. is shoved towards pre-med as though medical school were a casual hobby. A certain young soprano is allowed to believe every passing wise guy is an affectionate uncle, priming him beautifully for future exploitation. In Jason Barone's case, the result is literal bodily harm and a professional humiliation so pure Macbeth's witches could bottle it. One might charitably argue that the elder Barone never shared the details of his mob entanglements with his family out of some misguided hope that the criminal world would show mercy once he was gone. A touching fantasy, if nothing else. Others suggest that knowing someone only by a nickname can create genuine confusion. After all, who immediately equates Uncle Mike with the imposing formality of Michael A. Smith on official paperwork? Fair enough. But even this generous interpretation strains under the weight of Jason's performance. Adding to the lore, the actor behind this paragon of naivete reportedly endured a legitimately painful hit during the dock scene, courtesy of a co-star known for blending authenticity with enthusiasm. The line between fiction and reality occasionally blurs, and in Jason Barone's case, perhaps more sharply than intended. In the end, the character remains a testament to a recurring thematic truth. Protect a child too thoroughly from the world, and the world will introduce itself with interest. At $4 a pound, the cost of that education seems almost merciful. Never rely on hindsight when it only arrives to declare, Wegovy would have fixed everything. The great tragedy of Vito's arc, apparently, is that he was born a decade too early for the pharmaceutical miracle now known as Wegovy. Had it existed, the narrative goes, he would have shed the weight effortlessly, avoided the blood pressure medication, and most crucially, escaped the supposed side effect of becoming gay. Yes, in this charming alternate universe, queerness is something dispensed at the pharmacy counter next to the antihypertensives. In this fantasy medical timeline, even the sudden weight loss that set off alarm bells in his circle would have been neatly explained. Wegovy, someone might whisper, only to be shut down immediately, because in certain corners of organized crime, acknowledging modern medication appears to be as taboo as acknowledging basic science. One can practically hear the panicked chorus. No one has Wegovy, and no one wants to hear the word again. Of course, this sits alongside the ever-enlightened AIDS mob speculation, an environment where every cough is apparently a crisis, and every misunderstanding about immunology is delivered with absolute confidence. Tony's bewildered interrogation, complete with his unique interpretation of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, would fit right in. Then comes the fashion dilemma. Had Wegovy worked too well, Vito might have slimmed himself right out of his leather chaps. The mustachioed variety remains a matter of debate. Naturally, none of this has anything to do with identity, relationships, or human complexity. It's simply a question of whether the man could still fill out his motorcycle gear. Because yes, he was a motorcycle enthusiast meeting fellow riders. Nothing more scandalous than that, unless one believes Tylenol is also capable of rewriting sexual orientation. The entire discussion mirrors another familiar medical irony. Mahaffey finally receiving a prescription for Zoloft intended to curb his gambling, only after his debt had already led to his hip being shattered. Modern medicine always arrives right on time, as long as one defines on time as long after the damage is irreversible. If there is a unifying theme here, it is the bleak comedy of remedies that appear only in hindsight. Wegovy might have solved everything, from Vito's weight to his social camouflage, if only it had existed sooner. Instead, the characters are left with superstition, misplaced blame, and a deep faith in the curative powers of regret. If you've ever questioned why the show introduced Tony's long-lost best friend, only to rush him into tragedy, you're not alone. The perennial debate over the Blundetto storyline tends to split viewers into two camps: those who appreciate the narrative detour, and those who would happily excise the entire arc from the series canon. The character arrives with the subtlety of a wrecking ball, heralded as a brilliant, complex figure, yet behaving with the decision-making skills of a man who once misplaced his own common sense in a prison laundry bin. The writing insists repeatedly that this ex-con is gifted, perceptive, almost preternaturally intelligent. Yet nearly every action contradicts the advertisement. The infamous smuggled prison sperm anecdote is a prime example. It is less a plot point than an act of creative desperation, as though the writers felt compelled to justify his children's existence through the most convoluted method imaginable. One could be forgiven for wondering whether a straightforward explanation was simply too mundane for a man promoted as a genius, but written as a hazard to himself and everyone within a 5-mile radius. Still, the storyline has its defenders. The dramatic tension between protecting Blundetto and handing him over to New York adds genuine weight, and Steve Buscemi's performance is predictably magnetic. Watching him slip into a mobster role after years of playing skittish eccentrics offers its own quiet thrill, and his presence injects a peculiar spark into the ensemble. The resentment simmering around Tony's pool, envy, inadequacy, the subtle humiliations of reintegration, works precisely because that domestic tension feels truer than the supposedly brilliant schemes that go nowhere. The structural problems of the arc, however, have less to do with character flaws and more with production realities. Buscemi originally signed for 2 seasons, but the storyline imploded the moment Blundetto killed Billy Leotardo. The writers effectively cornered themselves, leaving no plausible escape route for a character who had only just been introduced as a long-lost intimate of Tony's. Complicating matters further, Robert Loggia's early departure, brought on by difficulties remembering lines, forced the removal of Feech Lamanna, whose plot was intended to intertwine with Blundetto's. With Feech gone, Blundetto's arc had to be accelerated, leaving his rise, fall, and execution feeling abrupt, underdeveloped, and suspiciously like narrative triage. Thus, the storyline's central problem emerges, not that Blundetto exists, but that he emerges from nowhere, immediately becomes the gravitational center of the show, and exits before viewers can form a meaningful attachment. The comparison to Ralph Cifaretto is telling. Ralph's arc unfolded over 2 seasons, with the pacing of a Greek tragedy. Blundetto's arrives as a surprise announcement, races ahead at full speed, and slams into a wall. In the end, the divide persists. Some admire the episodes for their tension and for Buscemi's undeniable presence. Others see a fascinating idea strangled by time constraints and narrative corner-cutting. Both are right. The storyline contains strong bones, memorable moments, and a compelling moral dilemma, but it is also unmistakably the product of a writer's room forced to sprint when it had planned to walk. Let's talk about the moment The Sopranos quietly broke its own logic and hoped no one would question it. The production's handling of Frankie Valli remains one of its more inspired sleights of hand. First comes the setup. A casino manager drags Tony upstate under false pretenses, not because of any underworld crisis, but because he wants Valli to perform there. Tony's irritation is palpable, delivered with the withering instruction to take that up with Frankie Valli when you talk to him. Then, with impeccable comedic symmetry, Frankie Valli materializes not as himself, but as Rusty Millio, a friend of a friend, not a friend of ours. It is the kind of casting choice that winks so audaciously at the audience that one wonders how no one in the narrative ever pointed out Rusty's uncanny resemblance to a certain pop icon. Evidently, in this universe, no one so much as pondered it. The show had already demonstrated a fondness for such metatextual games. Casting the mayor of Munchkinland was an early declaration of intent. Tim Daly received a name drop long before he arrived on screen as J.T. Dolan. Valli's appearance continues this tradition with a flourish. He has, after all, been part of the crew since late December back in '63. Less convincing is the notion that Tony would allow himself to be strong-armed by a casino manager with no apparent crew, muscle, or organized crime credibility. The charitable explanation is that a man in charge of a casino can summon an entire catalog of unsavory allies. But the show leads this to the imagination. And of course, art eventually mirrors life. Valli ends up on stage in his later episodes with the same tenacity as Uncle Junior in the final season. Still performing, still present, still part of the fabric. His tenure on The Sopranos may span 2 seasons, but his real resume boasts all 4 of them. Are you looking for the moment Christopher transitions from tragic figure to full-blown embarrassment? Christopher Moltisanti remains one of the great paradoxes of The Sopranos. A man so relentlessly volatile that even the show's resident sociopath eventually appears exhausted by him. His outbursts oscillate between petulant demands for answers and furious interruptions that drown out those very answers. An impressive cycle of self-sabotage masquerading as communication. His violence toward Adriana is presented with such miserable regularity that it raises the eternal question, why remain tethered to someone who has already demonstrated a willingness to strangle the life out of her, both figuratively and, on occasion, quite literally? Yet the sad reality is that many remain in abusive relationships, and the show never flinches from portraying that psychology. Even after being nearly choked into unconsciousness, she manages an "I love you" as he walks away, a moment that encapsulates both her tragic loyalty and his talent for eroding the spirit of anyone within range. By later seasons, even Tony appears visibly depleted by Christopher's endless cycle of self-inflicted crises. The man is less a protege than a perpetual storm system, loud, erratic, and always threatening collateral damage. Fans famously insist that no 2 opinions of Christopher are alike. This declaration of infinite variety is delivered with the confidence of people who have, apparently, surveyed every viewer across the planet, and, astonishingly, across galaxies as well. The claim collapses under even basic scrutiny, but then again, hyperbole is practically a supporting character in this series' fandom. Still, one consensus does emerge. Christopher is an embarrassment to nearly everyone around him. His presence inspires a sort of collective cringing, an instinctual reaction, much like witnessing someone smoke a cigarette in the rain with no hands, protected only by the aerodynamic marvel that is his nose. Nature provides shelter in the strangest forms. In the end, Christopher remains a portrait of wasted potential and chronic self-destruction, leaving behind a trail of chaos, regret, and cigarette ash stubbornly shielded from the elements. Ever wonder what happens when the least qualified men in New Jersey decide they deserve promotions in organized crime? The meteoric rise Sean and Matt imagined for themselves was always destined to stay exactly where it began, in their own heads. Their great tragedy, aside from choosing career advancement via attempted murder, was the belief that 5 minutes of half-hearted errand running should have placed them on an express track to becoming captains. Patience, apparently, was a luxury they considered optional. The fantasy goes something like this. If only they had marched up to Christopher, or even Tony, and requested more serious work, perhaps collections or strike-breaking, the gates of opportunity would have swung open. After all, when Christopher's authority failed to suit them, why not announce that he was unfit and attempt to report for duty under Richie instead? A flawless plan, aside from the small detail that Richie barely acknowledged their existence. His finest interaction with them involved cracking jokes with his back turned, an accurate summary of how deeply the organization valued their presence. The structure of the life they coveted was not exactly a mystery. Advancement requires time, loyalty, and a talent for generating schemes that don't end with one's own funeral. Eugene's promotion alongside Christopher illustrates the point. He was 20 years older, had actually survived the preliminary gauntlet, and proved that the life can indeed be lucrative, provided one avoids prison, bullets, and the hubris of assuming the rules don't apply. By contrast, Sean and Matt approached the entire enterprise like excitable interns, convinced they were running the company by lunch. Had they simply stayed the course under Christopher, they might have evolved into solid associates, especially by the later seasons when his own crew expanded. Instead, armed with impatience and the rhetorical flair of graduates from slip and fall school, they selected perhaps the dimmest scheme available, shooting the very man who represented their only real chance at advancement. Their failure was not mysterious. It was inevitable. People love to paint Artie as a victim. Here's what they leave out. The great mystery of Vesuvio's doomed trajectory is not why the restaurant burned, but why anyone ever expected a clean solution from a man whose life is an intricate web of loyalty, secrecy, and violence. The fantasy scenario imagines Tony offering Artie a tidy explanation, a quick, candid warning that a murder was scheduled to take place between the antipasti and the espresso, and that a complimentary cruise would spare everyone the trouble. In this hypothetical, Charmaine, unyielding but not foolish, might have recognized that arson by mafia proximity is a poor business model and gladly accepted the escape package. Naturally, that is not the world the series inhabits. The obstacle is obvious. Artie is a civilian. No matter the affection between the two men, the hierarchy of "this thing of ours" stands immovable. Disclosing a planned hit to an outsider would not only violate the code, but create a liability of cinematic proportions. The mere knowledge would make Artie an accessory, an indignity he later proves incapable of handling, even in the comparatively trivial realm of insurance fraud. Still, the counter-argument persists. If honesty was impossible, could creativity not have sufficed? There were countless less catastrophic methods to shutter the restaurant temporarily. Minor damage, a suspicious plumbing malfunction, a conveniently timed health inspection, even relocating the intended victim. But such practical options presuppose an institution where efficiency prevails over ego, protocol, and internecine politics. If the mob behaved like a logistics firm, the show would be considerably shorter. As for Artie himself, the notion that this single incident launched a downward spiral grants him a stability he never possessed. Sensitivity defined him. Disaster merely accelerated what was already brewing. Even if he had somehow been warned, he likely would have resisted closing his beloved establishment, clung to principle, and achieved the same ruin by another route. Ultimately, the tragedy rests on a simple truth. One cannot protect a civilian from the consequences of a world they were never meant to understand. Artie was never going to escape unscathed. Not with Tony in his orbit, and certainly not with the rules of that orbit shaping every choice made in the shadows. Subscribe.